This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Nick Miles, and at 14 hours GMT on Friday the 18th of June, these are our main stories. Health officials and politicians in Japan are in dispute over whether to allow spectators to attend the Olympic events in Tokyo next month. Iranians are voting to elect a new president, with all but one of the four candidates regarded as hardliners. After months of criticism, Israel has agreed to give the Palestinians at least 1 million COVID vaccines. Also in this podcast.
The pandemic has stopped almost everything except war, conflict, violence, persecution, all the causes that push these people to flee.
A tragic irony. In a year of lockdowns, refugee numbers spiral. Even at the best of times, hosting the Olympic Games is a bit of a poisoned chalice. It's great for the kudos of your nation, but it can often be a financial drain. The pandemic has made this far more complicated. Despite growing concerns about the spread of coronavirus, the organisers have doggedly carried on. Well, in a report today, Japan's most senior COVID advisor says banning all fans is the least risky and most desirable option. Meanwhile, in opening remarks at a meeting of experts on COVID-19 countermeasures, the president of the Tokyo Organising Committee, Seiko Hashimoto, said the aim was to find ways to hold the Games safely.
We would like to have a discussion today from the experts' perspective on how we can achieve a safe and secure Games. Based on your advice, we would like to implement solid measures.
What then to make of the situation? Rupert Wingfield-Hayes is our correspondent in Tokyo.
I think the impetus from the political leadership and from the leadership of the organising committee is towards having spectators. It appears pretty clear from what Mrs. Hashimoto has said and what Prime Minister Suga has said in the last few days that they want these games to have people in stadiums, albeit not in the normal circumstances. I think they're very much open to limiting spectators. That's what's going on in Japan at the moment. Sporting events have been going on in Japan with a maximum of 5,000 people in stadiums for really throughout the pandemic. And they seem to believe that the measures they put in place mean that they can do that with the Olympics as well, and that they can do so safely without the threat to public health. That does, however, seem to go very much in the face of the expert advice that we've heard from today. So, in that respect, there is definitely a conflict between the political leadership and the scientific leadership here.
Yeah, and it makes the politicians pretty nervous, I imagine. It's a bit of a hostage to fortune, particularly when still, even though public opinion is changing to a certain extent, still a lot of people in Japan just don't want the Games to go ahead at all.
Yeah, we had a situation before over the last few months where around 80%, between 70 and 80% of people in Japan either said they didn't want the Games to go ahead or they wanted them postponed another year. So about 40%, those two views. Now it's shifted somewhat to about a third saying they still don't want the Games to go ahead, a third saying they want it to go ahead but with no spectators, and then a smaller number, around 20%, saying you can go ahead with limited spectators. So public opinion has shifted, but you can still see there's a great deal of suspicion, fear and anxiety about the Games going ahead during the pandemic.
Rupert Wingfield-Hayes. During President Hassan Rouhani's 8 years in office, Iran's economy has continued to worsen and relations with the West have deteriorated too. Now, Iranians are voting for a new president. The country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, cast the first ballot and appealed for people to go to the polls.
Election Day is a day of the Iranian nation. Today, people are the main actors and stage directors. With their participation, the country achieves great advantages in the international arena. But the first to benefit are the people themselves.
This woman told us that she'd voted for the candidate expected to win, Ibrahim Raisi.
I voted for Mr. Raisi. As Chief of Judiciary, he proved himself and fought corruption, which is a big issue in our country. I voted for the most qualified candidate, and I hope he can also save our economy, which is in a very bad state.
Well, Kazra Naji from the BBC's Persian service says that voter turnout is expected to be low.
My own judgment, my own impression is that there will probably be a lower turnout than usual, and that is because a lot of people have boycotted these elections because they say there's no real choice for them in these elections. The Constitutional Guardian Council has limited the number of people, the candidates, to mostly hardliners of various shades, and basically paving the way for one of the most hardline of them to win the elections, the present head of the judiciary, Ebrahim Raisi. So on the whole, there is this general impression that this is a power grab by the hardliners because they've come to the conclusion perhaps that they're not going to win in a free and fair elections, and they have decided that they will boycott the elections.
Kazra, I suppose many people around the world are looking at the election, say that with great interest because of the nuclear deal, because of tensions in the region. How could the result affect those tensions and the possible renewal of the deal?
I think the way it's going and the fact that it's almost certain that Mr. Raisi will be the next president and the hardliners will control all centers of power in Iran, I think it's fair to say that we're going to have a period of greater tension between Iran and the West in the years to come. Iran will be looking more towards China for investment that it desperately needs, hundreds of billions of dollars, they hope. And in the region, I think there will be more of the same in the sense that these people, the hardliners, want to extend Shiism in the areas in Arab countries that are mostly Sunni and project power in these areas. So we will see more of the same on that front.
Kazra Naji. Tomorrow, Saturday in America, it is Juneteenth, which celebrates the end of slavery in the United States. As of one day ago, thanks to a bill signed into law by President Biden, it's a federal holiday. In New York, many lampposts, billboards and mailboxes have been plastered with stickers to let residents know that they were named after slave owners. A group of activists has launched the campaign to bring more awareness to the history and legacy of slavery. The BBC's Tom Brooke reports from New York.
Okay, black on black. Comedian and activist Elsa Waith listens to the song Black by the artist Buddy while spearheading the Slavers of New York stealth campaign to let Brooklyn residents know that Nostrand Avenue, where Elsa is standing, is named after the Nostrand family, who were slave owners. Elsa affixes a sticker stating this fact to a utility box.
A lot of people who live in and around these streets don't know who it's named for, how the street got its name, and so we are here to simply provide more information.
It's not necessarily common knowledge, but many prominent New York City thoroughfares, landmarks and institutions are named after slave owners, figures such as Peter Stuyvesant, John Lefferts and John Van Nostrand. This is what's being revealed by this project. Part of the Slavers of New York team is Maria Robles.
Knowledge is power. I think one of the reasons that racism, specifically anti-blackness, continues to be so pervasive is because there has not been a real reckoning with the history of slavery.
But what do New York City residents make of this stealth sticker campaign?
Before today, I did not know that Nostrand Avenue was named after a slave owner. It'll just give us a little bit of insight.
I appreciate this because it actually brings awareness to the community, which I think still suffers from slavery.
But some passers-by are a little more sceptical, wondering perhaps if the campaign is part of a broader effort to change street names so they no longer belong to slave owners.
Yeah, this is so far back, sometimes maybe it's irrelevant. Maybe we should change every street name, every town.
But Slavers of New York is adamant. As a stealth education campaign, they're not advocating any specific action, like changing the names of streets. Elsa Waith again.
The goal of Slavers of New York is actually just to provide information. Once the community is informed, they can decide what they want to do.
Some people have described what you do as vandalism. I mean, you have defaced that light pole there with your sticker, haven't you?
There's street art everywhere. There are posters everywhere. If this is bothering somebody, I would like to actually know why. When you live in a place that is full of street art and expression.
Orange is the new black.
This Slavers of New York campaign, with other awareness-raising endeavours, is changing the image of New York as a relatively benign player in the history of slavery. The South has long been seen as the region where slavery was most entrenched. But one survey shows that in the 18th century, 42% of New York households had slaves. Slavers of New York is letting people know just how much slavery was an intimate, if uncomfortable, part of their history.
Black.
Tom Brooke reporting. Now, a new species of ancient giant rhino, which would have been up to 10 times heavier than its modern counterpart, has been discovered in northwestern China. Paraceratherium lynxiense lived about 26 million years ago. Details from the BBC's Warren Bull.
In 2015, fossils were discovered near Wangjiachuan village in the Chinese province of Gansu. A research team from Beijing soon realised that these were not from one of the known species of giant rhino. Paraceratherium lynxiense had a distinctive slender skull, as well as a prehensile nose trunk, similar to that of the modern tapir. The hornless creature's head could reach 7 metres to graze treetops, making it taller than a giraffe. The scientists found that the new species was closely related to giant rhinos that once lived in Pakistan, suggesting it had travelled across Central Asia.
Warren Bull. Still to come on this podcast, we have failed. The UK government apologises for the low conviction rate for rape. Survivors say that's not enough.
If they want to kind of make this any better for those victims who have been through this, then reopen their cases.
And a former government minister in Japan is sent to jail for buying votes to help elect his wife. Israel says that it will give the Palestinians at least 1 million coronavirus vaccines, following criticism that it hasn't done enough to help immunisation efforts in the occupied territories. It will hand over jabs that are close to their expiry dates, which it doesn't need at the moment. And in return, the Palestinians will give Israel a similar quantity of Pfizer vaccines that it's expecting later this year. Russia, meanwhile, has recorded its highest ever number of daily infections. For months, the government has downplayed the pandemic, suggesting that the country has all but defeated the virus. But it's now battling a surge of cases. In Moscow, new daily cases have trebled in the last 2 weeks to more than 9,000, and further restrictions have been announced. Well, in response, the Kremlin has blamed the outbreak on nihilism. I heard more from Vitaly Shevchenko from BBC Monitoring.
There's a lot of concern coming from Russian officials now. There's talk of explosive growth in the number of new cases, which, according to the health minister, Mikhail Murashko, has jumped by 30% in just 1 week. Yesterday, Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin was talking to officials at a meeting, and he described the situation as extremely difficult. And this sort of alarm is echoed by state TV, which has been broadcasting direct calls on Russians to get vaccinated. In fact, on some of the main channels, that's how presenters sign off now: go and get vaccinated.
OK, so they're sounding the alarm, figures are going up, get vaccinated. They're blaming nihilism. What do they mean by that?
Well, this may be an example of how careless talk costs lives. They're saying that the public is ignoring coronavirus restrictions and is unwilling to get vaccinated. But let's have a look at how this happened. For months, Russians had been told by Kremlin-controlled media how successful their country is at battling the coronavirus, while the West was described as failing miserably. People were dying left, right, and centre, especially in Europe. And people were said to be confused about what's going on. There were reports of endless rioting and vaccine shortages. In fact, Western vaccines were described as part of the problem, supposedly causing more deaths. And then state TV would say, meanwhile in Russia, everything's fine. Restrictions are being lifted. Shopping centres and museums are opening. Students are going back to their universities, and vaccination is proceeding at pace. Only television would somehow never say how many Russians exactly have got vaccinated or how many have died because of the virus, because it's been all but defeated, supposedly. So This is probably the key reason why Russians are so distrustful of vaccines. And this is also an example of the limits that the state propaganda machine has, is just struggling to get Russians to go and get vaccinated.
Vitaly Shevchenko. The United Nations says that the number of refugees around the world hit a new record last year in spite of the pandemic. And more than 2/3 of those who fled abroad came from just 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan and Myanmar. Many were also displaced within Africa because of the conflicts in Mozambique, Ethiopia's Tigray region and the Central Sahel. Filippo Grandi is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees.
We went from 79.5 million people forcibly displaced in 2019 to 82.4 million in 2020. And I find this remarkable that in a year in which we were all locked down, we couldn't move, we had to stay at home, we were told that not to travel, still almost 3 million more people were forcibly displaced. It also shows that the pandemic has stopped almost everything except war, conflict, violence, persecution, all the causes that push these people to flee.
That kind of suggests to me the world isn't really listening to you. We've just seen the G7 a week or so ago. I didn't see any mention of refugees in the final statement.
The rich and powerful countries seem to wake up to refugee issues only when they touch their borders. I'm in the US now. Here, there is quite a lot of attention for the Mexican border because there's a huge problem there. And when I started as High Commissioner in 2016, the G7 was very focused because Europe was hit by a wave of people. But this is so short-sighted. And frankly, it's a little bit like with climate change, pandemic before this one. Global challenges don't seem to get that type of strategic response. You said I'm not listened to. Frankly, unfortunately, it's true. I'm quite used to it. We'll keep insisting because this is not just about values, humanitarianism, human rights. It's, of course, about all of that, but it's also about self-interest. The pandemic has shown us that if we don't respond together, then these problems come back to haunt everybody.
You mentioned self-interest there. What do you think about the moves by some countries? I'm thinking of Denmark most recently, to say, yeah, of course, we'll take refugees, we'll take asylum seekers, but we'll kind of outsource them to another country.
I think very negatively about this. I think it is one more manifestation of a trend that we've seen in recent years to say, let's build a wall, let's push them back at sea. And now the latest, let's externalize asylum. This is almost a colonial approach to buy asylum mechanism in other countries. But all of this is not only morally reprehensible, frankly, abysmally reprehensible on the part of rich and privileged countries, but it is also not effective. And this is where self-interest also plays a role. These movements will continue no matter what, but they will be more and more illegal, more and more irregular, more and more difficult to manage. Instead of building proper procedures to receive, to distribute, to integrate, and to send back those that are not eligible. All of this should be the focus of rich countries. And often it is not, because bad politicians push them in the wrong direction.
Filippo Grandi, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, speaking to our Geneva correspondent, Imogen Folks. A Japanese former justice minister, Katsuyuki Kawai, has been sent to prison for 3 years for buying votes to help his wife get elected to national office. Here's our Asia-Pacific editor, Michael Bristow.
Katsuyuki Kawai handed out more than $250,000 to 100 politicians and supporters to help his wife Anri get elected to Japan's upper house 2 years ago. She won, but has since resigned. She's also been convicted of vote buying, for which she received a suspended jail sentence. Mr. Kawai was Justice Minister for just over a month in 2019, before stepping down when this scandal was uncovered. Japanese prosecutors described the case as massive and unprecedented.
Michael Bristow. The UK government has apologised to rape survivors for low conviction rates, saying it's not good enough. Officials are now pledging to make changes to the system, as Charlotte Gallagher reports.
The figures are stark. Between 2019 and 2020, just over 1,400 people were convicted of rape or lesser offences, the lowest number since records began, despite reports of adult rape to police almost doubling in the previous 5 years. But while 13% of suspects were charged between 2015 and 2016, that number was just 3% between 2019 and 2020. Robert Buckland is the Justice Secretary.
I'm apologising to everybody for the position that we have got to. Whilst there have been a number of important and successful prosecutions, the overall numbers are just not enough.
So why has the situation got so bad? One reason is the way in which women and men who report rapes are treated. They may have to hand over their phones so their messages and social media accounts can be scrutinised, unlike other victims of crime. Some survivors blame a lack of support from authorities and the fear of being cross-examined in court and having their sexual history used against them. An official review also questions how the justice system, the police and prosecutors tackle the cases. Vera Baird is the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales.
It seems to me inevitably that the ministers are apologising for the fact that when